Hello, everybody, and welcome to the General Eclectic Podcast with Rod Dreher. I'm your host, Kale Zeldin, and today I'm very excited to have with us someone that I found out about just a few days ago when she published a Substack piece called By Any Other Name. We have Helena with us. Helena, hello. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me on.
Excellent. Well, look, I saw your piece. I think actually it was on Ash Wednesday morning. I have my morning ritual where I get up, make my coffee, and then I do Twitter while I'm drinking my coffee before my morning run with my dogs. And I think I saw, I'm not sure if you know who the writer Mary Harrington is. I think Mary Harrington had retweeted your Substack. So I am always interested in things that Mary Harrington tweets out and writes about. So I clicked on it and I started reading it. I'm not lying to you. I read, I think it was 2 or 3 paragraphs. I think it was just 2 paragraphs. And I immediately retweeted. It's like, you've got to read this thing. It gripped me right away. And so if you could just sort of jump, like, how has it been since it's sort of been picked up? And
well, I think you first need to say what was on the Substack. What was it about?
Yeah, so sorry. Yeah, I'm so deep into this. Sorry. So Helena wrote a moving story about her history transitioning to being a trans person to sort of detransitioning sometime later. And so this is sort of the account, your personal account of how that all started and how it's ended up. And now what you've been doing, I think it's been about 5 years for you. So that's sort of the gist of it. So anyway, what's the reaction been like and how's it been?
The reaction has been pretty intense. Thankfully, not a lot of negative stuff, or maybe I've just filtered my social media so well that I don't really see that kind of stuff. But yeah, just lots of people, I think, we're really thankful to hear my perspective, because I think a lot of people can tell that, with this transgender movement and all these young people identifying as transgender and transitioning, that things just aren't really making sense. The picture that the media is painting, it's just not really kind of answering their questions. So I think that my perspective, kind of talking about the social media things, the mental health things, was really refreshing to people. So I think people were really grateful to be able to read about that, especially, when it comes to parents who they have an adolescent who is going through a very similar thing. They've really been able to recognize their daughter or sometimes son and their family situation in what I'm writing about. And I think that informs them and empowers them to make better decisions in how they handle this kind of crisis.
Yeah. How old were you, Helena, when you first started on this path? Set this up for us, and what was the gateway for you into the trans world?
Yeah, so kind of how I described in my piece, as a child, I was not really somebody who anybody would have, identified as having any kind of gender issue. I was pretty average for a girl. Like I liked, all the kind of girl typical things. There were boy things, quote, that I liked too. But,
Sure.
My point is that I didn't have any kind of like persistent, noticeable gender issue. But that all very rapidly changed when I was about 15. And leading up to being 15, I was struggling with some issues. There was conflict in my family. I was developing some body image issues. Like my mom works in the beauty industry, so I just felt a lot of pressure about that. I was very insecure about myself. And when I was about 14, I just kind of had a falling out with a lot of my friends, and I found myself very isolated. And in that very isolated period of my life, I started going online a lot more. And something about me that I also describe in the piece is that, especially as an adolescent, I was the kind of person who I really liked my friendships to kind of revolve around my interests. I had a really hard time just having like, casual friendships, talking about drama at school, talking about, what's for homework, that kind of stuff. I really wanted to talk about these things I was very strongly interested in, books, musical artists, that kind of thing. And on the internet, that's where I was able to find these kinds of communities where I could really connect with people over these things I was very interested in. And so very quickly, I just started using the internet a lot more than I ever had. And it really just became a focal point of my life. And it became, it became my world in a way. I kind of checked out from school. I stopped really even trying to have social experiences in real life. And I just relied almost entirely on these internet communities that I had found for all of my socialization. And so that, being involved in those communities, there is a very prominent kind of worldview on there. People will know it as like social justice, or I know like a very popular term now is critical race theory. This kind of worldview was very, very predominant, and it was total in these internet spaces where I was in. And so just being introduced to that, I adopted those worldviews. I really wanted to fit in. And that exposed me to this kind of gender ideology that, kind of says, everybody has a gender identity. Most people don't know this because they've been brainwashed by society, but more likely than not, you're some form of trans. Nobody's really like, cisgender. And if they are, they're an oppressor. And so you kind of like feel this incentive to look at yourself and kind of re-examine your life experiences and try to decide like, what about me could be evidence that I am non-binary or I am transgender. And so I just really kind of got enmeshed in this, very this very specific worldview in these secluded online spaces.
When I was go
Yeah,
ahead.
no.
When I was reading your account and other accounts of detransitioners that I've read, one thing that jumps out to me, because of my own experience with my latest book, Live Not by Lies, is the extent to which these communities operate in a totalitarian way. They give you an ideology that explains the world. It offers you meaning, purpose, and community. And but the cost of this is freedom of thought. You must conform in every single way to join this community. Am I off here, or is there something totalitarian about your experience?
No, that's exactly how I understand it now. And being in these communities, like it's mostly teenage girls. There's I don't really know how this ideology found its way onto Tumblr. That's the website that I was using, and it's kind of built up a reputation ever since its founding that it's a hub for like social justice ideology. I'm not sure how that really happened, but on there it's like believing in these ideas is a prerequisite to any kind of participation in your interests. So it's like people go to this website because they want to look at art of their favorite fictional character, or they want to read writing, or they want to share thoughts that they're having about their favorite movie or TV show. But in order to do that, there's this kind of prerequisite that you have to align with these values and this belief system, not only passively, but actively. You have to participate. You have to, you have to denounce people. You have to kind of, if you are part of a quote privileged demographic, you have to kind of always be apologizing, always be acknowledging, always be kind of groveling about this. And so, yeah, I do think it's very totalitarian in that way, because it's just like extreme policing of thought, extreme policing of behavior. And the more of these kind of privileged identities that you hold, the worse that's going to be for you. And if you are somewhere in like the quote marginalized categories, it gets a lot easier for you. You're not so policed. People don't feel like it's as acceptable to bully you and make fun of you. Whereas in that privileged category, it's exactly the opposite. It's just kind of like free reign. People need to be mean to you because you need to pay for all of this bigotry and oppression that is done in the world.
Well, for people who are not watching this, who are only hearing it, tell us about your categories of privilege. How were you privileged in
Sure.
these?
When you started, I guess, and then,
Sure. So coming to this website and these communities, I was, a upper middle class, straight, white, female, cisgender. I don't like that term, but it means, you're not transgender. So even, you know, that category would be called like a cis het white girl. And like that descriptor in and of itself is derogatory. So like you will be, if you're, you know, in these communities, you'll see posts, you know, like cis het white girls are so stupid, cis het white girls are so blah, 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 blah. So it's like that, it's almost like that in itself is its own identity, and it's bad. Because
it's like a boogeyman category, right? I mean, it's sort of
yeah.
this bully that sits in this sort of collective imagination in which you're kind of defining your identities out from in an interesting way.
Yeah. And in these communities, like obviously in the wider society, the cis het white man has become kind of that boogeyman. But in these communities, it's mostly girls, it's mostly biological females. So that cis het white girl kind of takes the place of the cis het white man. So if you think of like all the kind of negativity and blame that is put forward onto this like archetype of the cis het white man, that's kind of how it felt for me as a cis het white girl in these online spaces. So there's just like a lot of guilt. You have to keep in mind that for these young people, like they, you know, they're adolescents. They're not thinking about this from like an adult perspective. They're thinking, I want to fit in. This is the most important thing in the freaking world to me. I want these friends. I need these friends. I need to fit in. I cannot not fit in. Like it's life or death, it feels like. So this kind of guilt that is laid on you and this bullying that is directed towards you, it feels very, very, very serious. So that's it's an intense motivation to kind of, even if you're not consciously doing it, even if you're not consciously thinking, how can I game this system? Like you are kind of observing, oh, this person just changed their pronouns and now everybody's so much nicer to her. You're observing things like that, right. And you're thinking to yourself, like, how do I get out of this position where everybody is so negative to me?
You know, I hearing you talk like this reminds me of what this Polish poet Czesław Miłosz said in his book, The Captive Mind, writing about the appeal of communism. He had gotten out of Poland and defected to the West. He said that people in the West think that the only reason people are drawn to communism is out of fear and terror. He said that's not really true. What it offers people who submit to it is a sense of feeling at home in the world. You know, and from the outside, it looks like total misery, but people can be so lonely and so anxious from a lack of meaning that they will be willing to sacrifice their freedom to have that. Does that sound like your experience?
Yeah, absolutely, especially for a very young person who is in a kind of, you know, maybe precarious situation. Like they don't have the reference for what does true connection and true friendship and true meaning look like. All they know is right now I'm in this period of loneliness. I feel like it's lasting forever. I feel like my life's never going to get any better. Here are these incentives to kind of change myself to fit into this worldview that is promising me friendship.
You had a line in there that really stuck out to me. You wrote, "A girl who is vanilla has no chance of pleasing a man." Can you unpack that for our listeners?
Yeah, so an aspect of this kind of social justice ideology is this idea of, you know, sometimes it's called sex positivity. And on the outside, like, that sounds great. Nobody should feel ashamed for, you know, being a sexual being, like, duh, like, but, you know, when you actually get down to it, what it means in practice, a lot of the times it's kind of, not only accepting, but really encouraging and normalizing kind of sexual behaviors that are not, I don't really know how to describe it, but just some sexual behaviors and sexual interests that most people just naturally don't really have, especially at a young age, like things that are very degrading, things that are painful, things that are disgusting, all sorts of different kinks and sexual interests that as a young girl, like when you've never even been on a date and never even held a guy's hand, like the idea of some of these things that are normalized in the sex positivity culture is very terrifying. but there's also this kind of idea that if you aren't sex positive, and if you aren't pro kink, and if you aren't having kinks yourself, then that means you're kind of lumped in with this outdated, conservative, prudish, Christian. These are all intended to be derogatory terms. You're lumped in with that. And so one kind of derogatory term for that is vanilla. Vanilla describes someone who is not into kinks. They just want to have, I guess you would say, normal kind of loving sex in the context of a relationship with one person.
Sounds horrible.
And so,
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
sounds horrible. But you can see, like, in this ideology, like that, which, you know, for most people would just be kind of the status quo for themselves. It has to have its own term to kind of other it from, you know, what is considered normal sexuality in this ideology, which is very abnormal sexuality in reality. So it's just kind of this very warped idea, and also in the context of kind of all of this happening online, with online pornography being so ubiquitous, and so many of these young people learning about sexuality and exploring sexuality through the context of watching pornography, you begin to get this impression that in order to have a, you know, in order to be a fulfilling sexual partner for someone in the future, you're going to have to adopt these behaviors that you're seeing in pornography that are degrading, painful, disgusting, etc.
So in the context of that, Helena, you know, you talk about Tumblr and you talk about this sort of this community of people. I mean, all of this is virtual in essence, correct? I mean, it's I get the sense from what you've talked about and other things that I've read about Tumblr that it's not really a meat space reality, at least not initially. And so you talk about the influence of kink and sort of capital Q queer, you know, influences in all this. In your sense of things, as you look back on all this and you're putting it all back together and making sense out of it, is this a forum for adults that are themselves sort of role playing as teen girls, as, you know, queer and non-binary, et cetera, and is this sort of a kind of, is there some sort of doubly malign influence on this in this virtual community?
There absolutely is that element of just kind of adults in these, I think fandom is probably the biggest place where this happens. Like, you have, for anybody who doesn't know, fandom is just like fan communities over something. So you'll have,
no, this is great. I mean, but you and I, as two probably pretty online people, understand that fandom is not like, you know, the way that I was a fan of, you know, whatever, a rock band in the late 80s. Fandom is its own thing. So maybe if you could give us a little bit of an insight, you know, the difference between me like waiting for my favorite rock band to show up once every 5 years, you know, once every 2 years when I'm a teenager. Fandom and internet culture have intertwined in such a way. What exactly is fandom?
Fandom is basically very strong communities that are devoted to creating content and discussing certain media. So books, TV shows, celebrities, movies. And yeah, like you said, it's not just, you know, something you do casually. It's oftentimes something that people who are kind of prone to obsessive thinking are the ones that you usually kind of find in fandom. And there is a large kind of teenage girl population. Like, if you think of in you know, in the last 100 years, you have seen this kind of concept of obsessive fandoms, you know, for the Beatles, for Elvis,
I was gonna say, perfect.
Yeah, exactly. So, but for the most part, it was young girls. And the internet allows this kind of mentality to just become even stronger, where it's like you can be plugged into 24/7 nonstop stimulation and conversation and new content about whatever it is that you are obsessed with. So that's kind of what fandom is. Fandom, it's really weird. Like, it seems like this kind of like obsessive personality type ends up just generating without restraints, it ends up just generating some really weird stuff. So when you get into like art and when you get into fan fiction, it can go some pretty weird freaking places. So it's not just, oh my gosh, I love One Direction or something. It goes 10 million steps further than that. And it kind of,
just again, for our audience's sake, like for instance, I've read Harry Potter, 2 times, the series 2 times. And like that puts me in a sort of I'm a weird 49-year-old dude who's probably read Harry Potter 2 times.
I didn't want to say anything, but I'm glad.
No, it's fine.
I
own that. But I remember when I was talking with my students, so I'm a teacher, and I remember, so I was teaching when books 6 and 7 came out. And, so like so I was into it. I couldn't wait for book 7 to come out. And so it was pretty exciting. And I went and I read it. And then I was sort of talking with my students about it because it's good for references since I teach English and literature. So it sort of helps that way. And then I remember one of my students sort of giving me a window into the world of fan fiction. And I'm like, wait, what? I had no idea. For me, like, it was just a cool book that I felt really immersive in, and I really had connected with all the characters. I mean, all that kind of stuff, which any great novel does, right? But this was a level that I just, again, I don't get the sense that my audience, our audience really understands what fandom is and fanfic is, and the immersive, almost perpetual adoration that is involved with these things.
And not only adoration, but kind of like taking that subject matter and running with it and like making your own, like, it's almost like the stuff that people write about in fan fiction, like it's its own thing. It's different than the original content. Like the original content may be the inspiration for it, but like it's its own world. Like it's not like, nothing is kind of true to the original plot. Like people take a lot of creative liberty with fan fiction. And so it's just really like this world that's just like heavy fantasy. It's very intense and it's very different.
So I'm starting to see, I think, how you went from being part of that world where you could create your own reality, and it was so intense, it felt like realer than reality. How you went from there to thinking, oh my gosh, I'm a guy. Can you walk us through that? I mean, how did you make that leap?
So actually for me, it wasn't really like a, oh my gosh, I'm a guy moment. It very much started with taking those small steps of, calling myself non-binary and putting a they, them pronoun. Yeah, putting a they, them pronoun on my profile. And then it took actually 2 or 3 years of just kind of like incrementally going deeper and deeper and deeper until I reached that kind of end where I was like, I'm a guy, I want to transition. But yeah, there's a feedback loop with all of this fantasy and all of this affirmation with these peers. And yeah, there's a lot involved. And I think for most people, actually, it's not a wake up and decide you're a guy. It's this kind of like slow process of immersing yourself more and more in the fantasy, getting this like positive feedback, and kind of almost self-indoctrinating.
That's a really
that's rich. It's rich. It reminds me, we talked in a couple episodes back, we talked about this idea that our liturgies, liturgies is sort of these things that we do in almost kind of like a semi-ritualistic fashion, but these liturgies that we adopt either literally as a kind of religious liturgy, but either just those sequences of things that we do on a day-to-day basis, these things form us. And when I was reading your piece, it sounded very much like your Tumblr habit. You enter in because you have certain proclivities and you're looking for something, but then at a certain point, it kind of turns and starts to form you. So I just wonder how that, maybe that's sort of what you're talking about, Rod, that this idea that it sort of begins to do something to you rather than you going to it for something.
Yeah, and I think one of the most obvious aspects of that is just kind of the action of scrolling, like perpetual scrolling, just always kind of having content and information kind of fed into your head. And so it starts out with, yeah, you just want to see, you know, drawings and fan fiction of your favorite show or whatever. And it turns into like, you are just constantly refreshing, constantly looking, constantly checking, and constantly being fed information. You're being fed judgments about what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, what's helpful, what's not helpful, what's going to feel good, what's going to feel bad, what's important, what's not important. And you're also being constantly fed kind of images, and you're relating to the images, you're projecting onto the images. Especially as an adolescent, your brain is kind of like primed. It's in this primed state for taking the information that you're gathering from the world and kind of incorporating that and experimenting with that for the end goal of kind of a stable identity as you exit adolescence and emerge into adulthood. And when your brain is kind of in this state and you're constantly just ingesting these opinions, these hot takes, these images, these stories, these perspectives, it really does begin to kind of form your identity.
You know, it's interesting you're saying that, because in the work I'm doing now on this new book, I'm finding out that we are what we pay attention to. And one of the guys I'm reading says, some scientists, and says that if we live in a world, if we allow ourselves to be immersed in a world where we're constantly receiving information, as you describe it, then we have no self. We have no agency. Wow. That if we're going to have agency and assert our own identity and build an identity, we have to be able to cut ourselves off from information and focus our attention. And that is an aside there. It seems like all of us have created a world in which it is almost impossible for young people to find stability.
Absolutely. And I think kind of going off of that, I think one of the major ways that we do build identity is through action and through experience. And when you look at the lives of these young people, like they're often coming from kind of a background where they've been very sheltered. There's even statistics about like kids these days, like they don't really have like a wide radius where they go out and play. Like maybe they'll go and play out in the backyard while they're being supervised by their parents, but they're not really going out there, and they're not, experiencing the things with their bodies. They're not taking risks. They're not building things. They're not really creating things as much as maybe in the past. And especially once you get to the age where kids are being given devices, especially like through school. I know a lot of schools, like they give these kids iPads from like a very young age. You have this situation where like this algorithm that just sucks you in is just constantly feeding stuff into your head, but you're never taking that, processing it, and like turning it into action, which I think in a more natural state without the technology constantly feeding your brain, you would be obviously absorbing information from your surroundings, but you would be kind of like digesting it and integrating it into how you behave as a person and how you act and how you express that. But now we have these kids where it's just, they're sedentary, they're alienated from other kids, oftentimes even alienated from their own families, and they're just constantly ingesting information with no process of like, okay, well, what does this mean for me as a person? Who am I as a person? And then so I think you have this kind of crisis with the younger generation that's, I think, behind a lot of these mental health issues that you're seeing, where like they're not really building a sense of self. They just have their heads filled with all sorts of information, and it's judgments, and it's negativity, and it's fear, and it's propaganda. And yeah, they're just not really kind of integrating into the world.
Helena, how did the adult world fail you at this time when you were making the transition from being part of the Tumblr fanfic world into identifying as male? How did the adult world fail you?
I think if I'm being generous, I think that, just adults don't understand like the significance of technology and social media and how much it changes the developmental experience of a human being when it's unrestricted. Sometimes like I talk to a lot of parents, and one thing that I kind of try to communicate to them is like, okay, so if your daughter wants to go for a sleepover, you ask her, you know, who is this kid? How did you meet? Where do they live? You know, what's their mom's name? What's their mom's phone number? You ask all these questions, you really try to be involved if you're, you know, an involved parent. But when they've been sitting on their phone for 6 hours straight, you have no idea who they're talking to. You have no idea what they're doing. You have no idea where they are per
Right.
se.
I love that.
And so
Yep.
I think that's I think that's one of the biggest problems. And you know, I think some people will kind of take the strategy of trying to restrict or control that internet usage without realizing that, you know, that adolescent or that child who's been raised with technology, they're so much more literate in it than an older person will be, and they're going to get around that. Like their friends are going to help them get around that. So I think that one of the biggest things that I think adults are kind of doing wrong is not being involved and not kind of getting to know, quote, where their kids are when they're on their devices.
What do you make of that, Helena? I mean, in other words, you know, you're a lot younger than us. You're looking at this, right? You're making sense out of it. You're looking back and you're looking forward and you're looking around you right now, and parents are coming. Why are they doing this? Like, what are we doing? Why are we pretending?
Why are you pretending? In what sense?
Pretending that the influx of this and a laptop and all of that into the lives of our children is just some small little thing. Like, you know, I got a new bike when I was in 5th grade, and, you know, my child gets, you know, a brand new iPhone or a laptop. I mean, why are we so delusional in pretending that a laptop or an iPhone is not a bike or a go-kart or something like that?
I think part of the reason is that even, you know, people who didn't grow up with these devices are finding themselves unable to really control themselves. And they're finding themselves really being kind of impacted in a way that is very confusing and very disorienting, maybe even on just a subconscious level. Maybe they aren't completely conscious of it. And I think that these companies that have made these devices and that have kind of injected technology into every sphere of our lives, they've really designed it to kind of be addictive and to kind of hijack your conscious decision making to the point where you are kind of enmeshed with these devices. And so I think for most people, like, that's something that people, like, I don't think they're ready to really wrap their heads around that. I don't think they're ready to really wrap their heads around how easy it has been to kind of under their noses change the world on such a massive scale and change human psychology on such a massive scale. And so it's easier, I think, to just normalize it and to just say, well, this is how the world is now. This is just technology. This is just innovation. This is just human development. This is just progress. And then not really see those dangers in terms of how it's going to affect a child's development. I think, you know, that there's some kind of dynamics at play like that.
You know, the thing that people my age always say is whenever you bring up an objection to something new, that's some new artist or musician or whatever, something shocking they've done, they'll say, well, people thought Elvis was bad in the old days. It's a cope, you know, it's a way to turn your mind off and not have to actually face what's going on. Yeah, the reason I asked you about adults was in part, I want to hear about your parents, what they did, but I also want to hear your take on schools, the school psychiatrist, the people at school, because one of the things that unnerves me about the place we're in now as a culture is the way schools, when it comes to gender issues, schools have written policies to deceive parents on this matter. How did that work for you in your story?
Yeah, so in my situation, I think the school absolutely played a role. And when I look back on it, it's kind of funny. Like throughout my life, I was up until, you know, the point where I decided to identify as trans, I was experiencing hardships in my life, and I didn't feel like the adults in my life were really paying attention. When I was a very small child, I lost a close family member, and this was absolutely traumatic to me, but the rest of my family kind of just took a don't talk about it approach. It was just kind of not acknowledged. I never really got to grieve it. And that stayed with me for a very long time. And then once I started hitting adolescence and I started experiencing kind of a compounding effect of, just issues at school, issues with friends, the body insecurity stuff, my mental health was really spiraling out of control. And yet I didn't feel like any of the adults in my life were really paying attention or caring about this. And then, fast forward, I'm identifying as trans. I'm kind of, self-indoctrinating. I'm going down this rabbit hole. Again, nobody's really paying attention. My parents didn't question anything. When I started changing my clothes, when I cut my hair, there wasn't ever a conversation.
How old were you
and
around
so then?
How old?
15 and 16.
Okay.
15
Sorry.
and 16.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. And then at age 17, that's kind of when I went to this school guidance counselor after telling my mom that I was trans and that I wanted to transition. And she had a very bad reaction to that. We got into a major fight. And so I went to the school guidance counselor saying, look, I'm trans. I need to transition. I know this is right for me, but my parents are transphobic and they don't want me to transition. Can you help me? And immediately, it's like she completely confirmed everything I was saying. She was saying, yes, we can help you. I'm so sorry that your parents are so transphobic. And to me at the time, that was kind of confirming my perception at the time, because for all these years, I felt unnoticed and kind of ignored. But then as soon as I word myself in the context of, well, I'm transgender, then like these adults are really paying attention and they're really coming forward. And they're actually later, when I was with that school psychologist, actually intervening and actually calling my mom into a therapy session and telling her, your son is going to be at a high risk of suicide if you don't affirm him. And so that gave me a lot of power. That made me feel, finally, I'm getting support. This must be right for me. This feels so right. This feels so good. And so that just really encouraged me more than anything else, I think.
So what do you make of what schools are doing now, affirming kids and not telling parents as a matter of policy what's going on with their kid?
I think some of these school administrators and school therapists and teachers are very called to this because they feel helpless in every other area. Like if you look at the last 10 to 15 years, mental health issues, or like the mental health of adolescents, has just really gone downhill. These young people are not adjusting to the society. They're not adjusting to the school. And it's really kind of there's been an explosion in teen suicides, teen hospitalization, teen diagnoses, teen psychiatric drug prescriptions. And I think these teachers and these school psychologists and everything, they don't know what to do. And that was very much my experience, where I would kind of go to like the school psychologist or whatever, or a friend of mine who was also really depressed and cutting and stuff, would go to like that school psychologist and they would just have no answers. But then you get these kind of like trainings come in. I'm sure there's all sorts of trainings that they hire, these LGBT organizations, and they come in and they say, oh, all of this stuff, these mental health issues, this depression, this cutting, this is all a sign of being transgender. And when a kid comes to you and they've been that kid who's been cutting and you don't know what to do and you don't know how to help them and they're just failing and their academic performance is plummeting, and you don't know what to do for them. When that kid comes to you and says, I'm transgender, then they finally feel like, now I have control, now I can do something. And if I just help this person get these medical interventions, and if I just, quote, support them by agreeing with their perception that they're transgender, I'm saving them and I'm finally doing something. And I think that these people, I don't think it's all necessarily malicious. I think that it's just a bad situation overall. Like the school system sucks. Mm-hmm. Modern adolescence and childhood sucks. Mm-hmm. And nobody knows what to do. But this idea of gender as being the explanation, it's really sucking in the kids themselves as an explanation for why they're so miserable and what to do about it. But it's also very appealing to the adults who are in charge of caring for those kids.
It's interesting you say that, because a friend of mine who came to me 7 years ago when her daughter was on the verge of joining this, and the daughter did later come out as trans, she said that the parent culture at her kid's school was so toxic, it was so bullying, that if you had any questions at all, if you questioned the trans narrative at all, you would be savaged by other parents whose kids were going through this. So it was absolutely a form of manufacturing consent by silencing dissent.
But and you can see
Absolutely.
how you can see how effective it is. You know, you have a child who's in some ways quite distressed and is presenting with all of these mental health symptoms, et cetera. And the sword that is kind of dangling over the heads of the adults in the room is, if you don't affirm, then this child will kill themselves, right? And it's remarkable how effective that is in selling the ideology, or, you know, as you point out, you know, in the piece, you know, the state religion of the Republic of Tumblr, you know, that it's like, this is the answer, this is the thing, just relent, you know, submit, let go, you know, come to the light. You know, it's so very religious to me, you know, just in terms of the workings. You know, it's like, you know, I used to be lost in the woods, and now I found the light, and if I can just orient myself in the right way, and if everybody just supports me, you know, that I won't kill myself. And it just strikes me as demonic.
Yeah. And those exact same motivations are really, I think, motivating the teachers and the guidance counselors and the therapists and everything, because they're lost. They don't know how to help these kids. Like, how would you feel if you're a school administrator or a school therapist, and there's a bunch of kids at your school who are cutting themselves and attempting suicide and having eating disorders, and you're having no effect on it? There's nothing you can do, but this is your job. This is what you went to school for. This is what you devoted your life to, and you feel like a failure. And then all of a sudden, this ideology comes along that explains it all and tells you, oh, if you just, you know, funnel these kids into the gender system, the gender medicine, you're saving them, and you're a savior, and you're just the best person ever, and finally you have meaning, and finally you have purpose.
Right. Like, I signed up to be an angel, and so now I have a way to be an angel to these things. And you know, you talk in the piece, you know, I wanted to talk, you know, you finally relent, like this, everything that's been kind of going on in the lab of Tumblr, in the temple of Tumblr, you know, it finally jumps, and you make this sort of incredible mad dash to Chicago to a Planned Parenthood clinic, you know, and they give you some, you know, large prescription dose of testosterone, you know, so you finally, I'm going to do this thing. This stuff that's been taking place in this virtual space, I'm going to make it real. And yet, in your attempts to make it real, it actually created, your words yourself, you felt like a monster. I wonder if you could sort of just pull us into that headspace, because I think that's such a unique thing, you know, for you to have this experience as a biological woman, and yet also to have these literal injections of this hormone that makes people more like me, right? I mean, like, what was that like on the inside out?
Yeah, I think in some ways, I can't assume that this is the average male experience, because like, I am a biological female. My body's not designed to have that much testosterone. And also, it was a much higher dose than I think most people are prescribed. Like, it's, if you read my piece, I have the pictures of my medical records and stuff. Like, it's crazy. They prescribed me the maximum dose. And so I think that that's very different than like the average male, but it also has made me really appreciate kind of what men are dealing with, especially boys going through puberty, when it's like, one moment you're like this child with, you know, similar testosterone levels to a girl, and then all of a sudden your testosterone is going up through the roof, and you feel like you're going insane, and like you're just jumping out of your skin. I've had a lot of really interesting conversations with men now about like how difficult that was for them growing up, and how important it is to kind of have like a role model and guidance going through that, because it's just not something that women understand. As a girl growing up, like, there was no words, like there was nothing that you could have written in a freaking informed consent packet that would have prepared me for that. It was insane. So
in reading your piece, you talk about this harrowing moment where, you're a girl, you're a woman, right? And when you would feel overwhelmed, you would tend to be moved to tears, to cry. Like that was sort of some sort of release of the emotion. And then you're in this awful situation where like you literally cannot cry. And so you have to inflict pain upon yourself in order to have that release, because you're feeling all of this anger and rage. I was reminded, there was a piece, a podcast done by Barry Weiss, and she was interviewing a detransition, F to M, back to F person, and they talked about the sort of what it felt like to have testosterone on the inside. And I'm listening to it, and I'm reading your piece. I'm like, yeah, that sounds about right. I mean, how many young boys have holes punched in the walls of their bedroom? Like most of them, right? It's like this weird thing that happens when you have the influx of the stuff. So, but for you, it was not. You did not describe in the piece at any moment where you felt the kind of euphoria that I've heard in other testimonies, that I got the testosterone and I had this immediate sense of like, something exciting has happened. You don't describe that so much. What was your long-term experience of it?
Yeah, so I think potentially the reason why I didn't experience that is because a week after I started the testosterone, I got into that huge altercation with my mom, and just in the weeks after that, there was just a bunch of other just stressful major events that happened in my life. So I just kind of like got bulldozed a little bit by the story of life. So if there was any kind of like euphoric effect, I think just the fact that I was going through so many difficult things at once, maybe just drown that out. So I'm not sure, but yeah, for me, it was mostly like I did feel kind of an increased energy, but it wasn't like a positive energy. It was like this restless kind of irritable energy. And I just really didn't recognize myself. I'm a very sensitive person. So like changes and stuff and how I'm feeling or my environment, like I'm very sensitive to those things. So when I just started feeling different inside, it was more uncomfortable for me than it was exciting. So yeah, I just remember feeling like I couldn't, like I was changing and I was different, and I couldn't understand why. I wasn't making that connection that it was the testosterone for one reason or another. I think that's because I was just so kind of emotionally dependent on the testosterone being the thing that was gonna like save me. So I couldn't really handle any kind of negative criticism of it. So yeah, I just became very irritable. I was isolating. When I would socialize with people, I just felt so unlike myself and so off and so weird that I couldn't really connect with people. I couldn't enjoy myself. I couldn't relax. And so that would just kind of progressively get worse and worse and worse. And I would just kind of, my mental health and my functioning would just progressively fall apart. And I stopped going to class, and I eventually just dropped out of school because I was so dysfunctional. And then my close friend and I, we decided that we were just gonna move and start a new life together, because this whole trans thing, it wasn't really panning out, but we couldn't accept that. We just thought it was, like the place isn't trans friendly enough. The school isn't trans friendly enough. It's all on the outside.
Your friend was trans too.
Yes, and she's also detransitioned now. Yeah.
So you paint that picture. The thing, this image, I think the most painful image for me in a piece, and I say this, it's an amazingly evocative piece. I don't mean it in a bad way, really. But you and Jamie are, I guess, in your studio apartment, and you're lining up. You're trying to get yourself to inject, and it's like this, like you don't want to do it, but you have to do it.
Yeah.
And it's this weird thing. And it's like your arm is almost this alien thing that's doing it. And your mind is sort of saying, don't do it. And your arm is like that. To me, I don't want to get too, kind of woo about it, but man, it felt like some kind of strange possession or something, some sort of like spirit.
I thought the same thing
Yeah.
when I read it.
Absolutely. I like looking back on it, I can clearly see how there was kind of like my intuition inside that was screaming at me to just like stop. And I ignored it. And I would actually sit there for, not exaggerating whatsoever, an hour or 2 hours trying to get myself to drive this needle into my leg, because what people don't understand, it's like a 3-inch long needle, and it has to go all the way into your thigh muscle.
Oh my
It's
gosh.
not just like, it's not a flu shot.
Right,
It's
I
like
was
you
just
have
about to
to
do-
stab
Oh
yourself.
my gosh.
Yeah. You
We're
have
done
to
here.
drive this
Goodbye.
needle all the way. And so my subconscious, my intuition was just screaming at me like, don't do this. But I would sit there and I would kind of keep trying without, injecting it as deep as it needed to go, and have to keep doing it until I was able to get it as deep as it needed to go. And yeah, it was just like this incredible, that's kind of why towards the end of the piece, I describe it as self-harm.
Right.
And I describe it as, just really not respecting myself and really trying to erase myself, because that sitting there and doing that and forcing myself to drive that needle into my leg when every like fiber in my body was kind of begging me to stop and making it so difficult, that I feel like is the self-harm.
Yeah.
Where I was actively, just disrespecting, ignoring, and acting against what I deep down knew was right.
Right, because here's the thing, like being a teenager sucks, and we all went through it. It's awful, it's awkward, and you learn to sort of hate yourself in a weird sort of way. But it's so much, I'm reading this piece, and I'm talking to you now, and I'm like being heart-wrenched, because like you're worth it, right? Like in a real way, like you are worth it. And like you feel like this thing is possessing you and telling you you're not worth it. You're not worth it. You're terrible. And it's just my God, it's the lie of lies, that you're not worth it. And the other part, I'm sorry I keep talking here, but I'm just so taken by it that you would have had to have done this for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And so you talk about informed consent, and that, God, those two words put together in the context of this article, I want to like punch somebody talking about someone with testosterone coursing through his body. Like, I want to punch somebody, because what do you mean informed consent? There's no informed consent here. What a lie. Yeah. What an absolute lie.
It's a total joke. Like I was not informed, and like I was saying earlier, I don't think there really is a way to properly inform someone, especially a young person who doesn't have a lot of life experiences, who like I even like wasn't even friends with a lot of guys. Like, how do I know what it's going to feel like to have testosterone in my body? I wasn't having those conversations. I didn't have that perspective. So really, I don't think there is a way to inform someone, especially not through a little piece of paper.
Yeah, I mean, it's a joke. I mean, not even, much less blood work or anything like that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rod.
I was going to say, I'm trying to be respectful of your time, Helena. How old were you when the spell broke, and how did the spell break and you decided that you were going to detransition?
Yeah, and I'm willing to stay for as long as we need to finish our conversation. But I was 19 and a half when I had that kind of wake up moment that I described in the piece. What was the second part of your question?
I was going to say, what event was it that caused the spell to break? And
you use those words. I did, you talk about it as a kind of spell breaking. So
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly how it felt. So the event that triggered that for me was this friend of mine, the same one that I was talking about earlier. We remained very, very close friends for a number of years. But so she made this kind of video for me to kind of like commemorate our relationship. And she included a bunch of photos of us, at different, events or during different activities that we did. And it was in chronological order from the day we met, which was 2 days after I started testosterone, up until very, very recently. at the time when she made the video. And so I was like, okay, let's watch this video. And so she puts the video on, and it's set to like dramatic music too.
Right.
And so I'm watching this video, and it's like, I see my 18-year-old self 2 days after starting testosterone. And I'm just kind of like this kid, like I'm this like round-faced kid, smiling, so hopeful, just started college, just met all my friends, just started testosterone. I feel like life is going to be so amazing. And that kind of is really radiating out of me in these photos. And then it slowly moves, and I slowly just get more kind of like sunken looking, more flat looking, more sad looking, more hollow. I don't have that joy in my face anymore, that hopefulness. I just have kind of this deadpan look up until the most recent picture, which just kind of reminded me of like how freaking miserable I was. And so just watching this and seeing that in front of me, like that progression, it just solidified this feeling that I was having, where the trans thing was not panning out. Like the fantasy that I had as a teenager was not a reality. And not only was it not a reality, but I was getting the exact opposite of what I paid for. I was just totally dysfunctional, totally miserable, feeling like I was insane. And so that just like the dam broke. And I fully realized it was just like this split moment of like, this was all a complete mistake. Everything from that first pronoun change on Tumblr was a total mistake.
So you write, war against yourself comes with a cost. What have the major costs been for you?
For me, fortunately, I will say, they have been mostly psychological. I didn't experience any long-term, health consequences, which is not something that everyone can say. There are plenty of young women who have been on testosterone, and for one reason or another, like it's just, they have health issues now because of it. But for me, that cost has really been all of these decisions that I made about my life at such a young age, in such a small time frame, pursuing this fantasy of like being this trans boy, so happy, so authentic, like this kind of pipe dream, like the kind of just disintegration of my family, which even in the beginning didn't have a great relationship. But it's like, my parents are divorced now, they hate each other now. I think one of the main reasons was just the chaos caused by my trans identity, the pain that inflicted on my little brother when I left home in pursuit of this crazy trans dream, when he like really needed me, and he was going through so much pain in his own adolescence, my little brother. So just a lot of guilt about that. My grandma developed Alzheimer's during the time that I was identified as trans, and I didn't talk to her. And by the time I detransitioned and did talk to her again, her Alzheimer's is so severe now that she as a person doesn't really even exist. And so I also have to cope with that, like not being able to say goodbye to my grandma because I was off doing this crazy freaking thing. And, there's just so many things, being my friend and I, we kind of really became enmeshed because we had this story in our heads that it was just us against the world. We're these trans people. We're gonna, be together against the world, this transphobic world. And we just kind of pooled all of our finances and just got into this really messy situation. Pulling that apart was extremely stressful and extremely just kind of damaging. And yeah, just the aftermath of all of those just mental health issues that I was having on the testosterone, like, those kind of like rage meltdowns, hurting myself, being so isolated. You can't just like, it's hard to just move past that. It's like, you really have to reckon with like, that was such a dark period of my life. And I felt so unlike myself, and I really harmed myself going through all of this. And I guess the most fundamental thing is, just reckoning with the amount of harm that I inflicted on myself psychologically, the amount of hatred that I was directing at myself, and just undoing this mess. And also, like I said, reckoning with these things I'll never be able to get back. Like, I have relationships that are permanently damaged, I think, and people that I've harmed, and myself that I harmed. Like, I'm still trying to build myself back up into like a healthy person.
How old are you now?
23.
23. You seem to have come a very long way from the young woman you described at the point when the spell was broken. So looking back now, what would you say are the lies that you have to believe to be part of the trans cult or a trans ally?
Ally, yeah.
Yeah. I would say the major lie is that everybody has a gender identity, and that gender is this simultaneously socially constructed and innate feeling that you have about yourself. And it's its own thing. It's completely separate from your biology, and that the only way for someone to be happy is to, align their body with their gender identity. So if someone feels like they don't completely fit in with girls, or they don't completely fit in with boys, that means that their gender identity is different from those girls and those boys, and that they need to be aligned with their gender identity physically. I think that is just such it's so absurd that it's almost disgraceful that our society has adopted it so readily in so many sectors. Like, it's such an oversimplified look at humanity, and why humans feel the way we do, and why we may struggle socially, and how we develop an identity. It's just like a total mess. But yeah, I think that that's one of the major beliefs. And also, going even deeper than that, I think you have to accept this general belief about privilege and oppression, and these hierarchies, and this oppression, and this bigotry, that I think it's historically ignorant. It's ignorant to humanity. It's just like such a limited perspective. It's very damaging. And
Yeah.
I don't think that people can't really be functional humans like believing in that.
Yeah, it's something only, we in our ironically very privileged 21st century, first world affluent lives could possibly believe. It's so divorced from a kind of, lived reality. Look, it sounds to me like you've been to hell and back, and I only vaguely mean that metaphorically. And I think what you are doing right now is genuinely powerful. The witness that you can give to kids and to parents who are going through this. You have made it out the other side, not without your scars, not without your pains that you just laid out for me and Rod and for the rest of our audience. And those are real things. And I can feel that, through the Zoom call here, I can feel that. But, you made it through. And just that fact alone, that you could make it through and share this kind of perspective, is, I think, a real grace and a real gift that you can give to some hurting people. And so I don't want you to, those scars are important, and I think you need to understand. I'm just speaking as a dad, I guess, but I think it's important that you give witness to these things. And look, all of us have our regrets. I mean, I didn't go through this because, for time and space and personality reasons, right? It just wasn't in my, but it's just so important what you did. I'd never reach out to some random person on Twitter and say, man, I love your Substack, come on my show, because it's just so real and authentic, and important. And we don't get that, right? I mean, people like me and Rod, we'll get trashed for being anti-trans and, called bigots and that sort of thing. And that happens to both of us, fine. But you being able to sort of having walked through hell, can offer a perspective that is, they can't shut you up, because that what you've been through is real. The unreality, the unreality of going through this trans ideology is offset by the fact that you're a real person. You've been through a real thing, and you've emerged on the other side. So I want to encourage you. It's just so important.
Oh, likewise. And I want to ask
Thank
you real
you.
quick before we go, did this experience change your views on culture, on politics, on religion in any way?
Pretty dramatically. Um, like I said, like I used to just be kind of a indoctrinated social justice warrior. And when I had my realization, I talk about it in the piece, kind of my journey of how I began to rethink my beliefs about gender. And that obviously, that was definitely the first step. But once I realized how wrong I was about gender and how much just falsehood that these beliefs about gender carried, and how just oversimplified and kind of packaged and canned they were, and how easily I was manipulated into believing them, and how much pain that brought me, I started to look at everything else too, because I started to see those same dynamics about other political issues and about kind of social justice more broadly. So I guess the next step from just the gender was kind of re-examining the kind of leftist, like social justice woke belief system that I had. And yeah, I very quickly realized that these same very toxic totalitarian, information control, thought control, emotional manipulation, kind of identity control, really, mechanisms that were at play in the trans community are also at play about all these other things. And then, in the last 2 years, there's been COVID, and I kind of applied very similar criticisms to that. And yeah, I've just really noticed how there's just a phenomenon of unreality in our society, where so many people are kind of buying in to a belief system where they're not getting good information, they're being emotionally manipulated. And I think that's incredibly dangerous and incredibly scary. But that's kind of been the biggest shift for me, of just stepping outside of that. And I don't know if there's a word that describes my political views now, but I guess it's just like I'm critical. Like when I see information now, I'm critical. When I see, people getting whipped up into a frenzy over something in the news, I'm very critical of that. I
Yeah,
don't
that's the
allow
best way to
myself
be.
to
Yeah,
participate in that.
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel
So
that
that's
way.
been the
We're going
biggest
through
change.
that. I feel like we're going through that now with the war. And it's
Mm-hmm.
frightening to me because I remember back in 2002 when we were getting ready to go to war with Iraq. I was caught up in that too because I lived in New York on 9/11, and I was so full of moral panic, and it
Yeah.
led the country to some bad things. And you can see that start once you become aware of that process from the inside. And if you learn from it, if you ever get out of it, it unnerves you to see it happening again. And I think I've been close to panic about the feeling that we're getting closer to a big war, because people are so intoxicated by the moral certainty and the sense of community that comes with moral certainty.
Yeah, absolutely. And with everything else, like kind of that's been looming overhead in the past 2 years, with just like these, I feel like COVID really changed the dynamics of like what is acceptable power, what are acceptable social responses, like all of these kinds of things are really changed in COVID in a way that I find very negative. And I just, yeah, it's hard to not be very anxious about some of these things.
Yeah, well, is religion never part of your life, or is it part of your life?
I grew up going to a Catholic school. That's actually kind of one of the ironies. So my parents are both conservative and they're not very religious, but they identified that like the public school system was, not something that they wanted to put their kids into. And so they sent us to a Catholic school. They got me anyway. But
no, some Catholic schools are the worst for this sort of thing. And I mean, I guess the reason I'm asking you is because I have conversations with religious leaders sometimes who don't really think this is serious. And I want to say to them, would you wake up and see what's happening? They're coming at our kids from 1,000 different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Something really interesting that I've kind of observed is because I've had a couple of times now religious leaders reach out to me because they're like, hey, I'm in the administration of so-and-so church, and we have 7 families who are transitioning their kids. What the hell is going on? So it seems like there's a little bit of a phenomenon there with very religious people buying into this, and
Well,
it's so weird. Yeah.
I think you could see why, right? Because, again, one reading of your By Any Other Name piece here, is that you're really talking about a girl. I mean, you keep talking about, I'm looking for happiness. I'm looking for happiness. I'm looking for happiness. Well, that is, definitionally what, Christianity is supposed to be about. This is Aquinas. We seek happiness, right? And so you're looking for some sort of mechanism that will allow you to orient and order your life in such a way that you will achieve happiness. It's fundamentally a religious one, right? And so you talk about being on Tumblr, and you don't want to be a cishet sinner, you want to be an NB saint, right? I mean, that's the whole operating system is a kind of parasitized version of a saints and sinners type religion. So I mean, I'm not surprised. And Rod, you and I talk about this all the time, but the challenge of our time is that we collectively, we don't know what we're for, and there are all too many, folks and outfits and Tumblr and whatnot that will tell you exactly what they think you are for. And this particular ideology, Helena, you went through, is that what you're for is, a life of perpetual, worship at the altar of gender ideology.
Enslavement to big pharma.
Right. Which is your perpetual, it's a client, you're sort of a client there. So, well, look, I'm so thankful for you coming on, Helena. This must be, I don't know if you're probably worn out, but I just, it's such an important topic. I knew right away that my audience, our audience really needs to hear this stuff, and not just me and Rod complaining about it on the outside, but a witness on the inside that has sort of been through the battle. And, not to get super nerdy on you, this is sort of, Bilbo who goes through the whole action of the Lord of the Rings. He's changed by it, and yet he's still a witness to it. So anyway, thank you so much.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, that's just kind of what I'm trying to do here. It's like, I feel like it's such a great injustice that so many lies are in this narrative that is just not true, is being told about, what I went through and what the nature of that experience is. And it just is causing so much devastation on so many levels that I just need to, I feel the need to come out and just like say the truth.
Yeah.
Well, stick around for just a second. Kale and I are going to say goodbye, and then I want to have some parting words after we're gone.
All right, Rod, do your thing.
Don't get nothing on you.
All right.